At Hamilton's John C. Munro International Airport, a chill wind sweeps across the tarmac as US Secretary of State Marco Rubio steps toward awaiting aircraft cameras flash, microphones cluster, and amid the rhythmic whir of engines, Rubio pauses to deliver a message of cautious confidence. He says he's optimistic that the United Nations is close to finalising a resolution that could define the next chapter for Gaza standing before reporters after a two-day meeting of G7 foreign ministers in Niagara-on-the-Lake. The Secretary's tone is measured but purposeful. "We are optimistic," Rubio begins. "We are making progress on the language of the resolution, and I hope we will finalise this very soon." His words carry both relief and restraint, signalling that behind the optimism lies an intense diplomatic negotiation still unfolding line by line, clause by clause. The proposed United Nations resolution, according to US officials, centres on establishing an international security force for the Gaza Strip, a move meant to stabilise the region after months of devastating conflict and humanitarian crisis. For weeks, diplomats have debated not just who would take part in such a mission, but how it would function, who would fund it, and how its legitimacy would be perceived on the ground. Rubio, relatively new in his post as Secretary of State, has tried to balance urgency with diplomacy. "It needs to be done the right way," he adds. "There are many different countries involved. We have to balance their interests in how it's structured beyond just the security force." In those few sentences lies the weight of the challenge. Nations like Egypt and Jordan have long expressed concern about the risks of being drawn into Gaza's internal complexities. European partners have pressed for clarity on the mission's mandate. And in the halls of the United Nations in New York, language is being carefully calibrated to avoid the political tripwires that have derailed similar efforts in the past. As Rubio boards his plane, reporters shout final questions across the tarmac. The Secretary waves briefly, then disappears inside the aircraft. His optimism, however, remains the headline, an optimism that the world hopes is not misplaced. Earlier in the day, in the picturesque setting of Niagara-on-the-Lake, the G7 foreign ministers gathered for their annual meeting, a photo opportunity framed by autumn leaves and quiet urgency. Canadian Foreign Minister Anita Anand hosted her counterparts, including France's Jean-Noel Barrot and Rubio himself, as they discussed not only Gaza, but a series of flashpoints that have strained the global order. From Sudan's civil unrest to renewed hostilities in Eastern Europe, the ministers faced a crowded agenda. But Gaza, still smouldering both literally and politically, dominated every conversation. Rubio's statement on Gaza wasn't the only moment that drew attention. Reporters pressed him on another issue gripping South Asia, the deadly car explosion in New Delhi that killed several civilians just days earlier. The blast, widely described by Indian authorities as a terrorist attack, reignited tensions between India and Pakistan. Rubio addressed the matter head-on. "We're aware of the potential that this holds," he said, "but I think the Indians need to be commended. They've been very measured, cautious, and very professional in the way they're carrying out this investigation. That investigation continues. It was clearly a terrorist attack, a car loaded with highly explosive materials that detonated and killed many people." His comments were a deliberate attempt to strike a careful tone, acknowledging the threat while urging restraint between two nuclear-armed neighbours. In Washington and Ottawa, officials have watched with quiet concern as New Delhi's investigation unfolds, aware that missteps or misinformation could escalate tensions. Rubio's message underscored Washington's desire for stability, not confrontation. But perhaps his most sobering remarks came when he turned to the crisis in Sudan, a conflict often overshadowed by the headlines from Gaza or Kyiv. "We share many of the same concerns that others have," he said, about how it could become a hotbed for jihadist and terrorist activity. But the solution is not to fight a war where civilians are literally being targeted for rape, sexual violence and murder. And that's what's happening. His voice, grave and deliberate, cut through the diplomatic language that often masks the brutality of war. In just a few sentences, Rubio placed human suffering back at the centre of the discussion. Throughout the G7 meeting, the recurring question was whether international institutions, particularly the United Nations, can still respond effectively to global crises. For years, scepticism has grown around the UN's ability to enforce peacekeeping mandates. The Gaza resolution, in that sense, represents both a test and a symbol. If finalised, it could signal a renewed confidence in collective action. If it stalls, it would reinforce the perception of paralysis. Diplomats familiar with the talks say the United States has been quietly lobbying regional partners to support the proposed security force, which would operate under a limited mandate focused on stabilization and humanitarian access rather than governance. But key details remain unresolved, chief among them who will lead the mission and whether Israel will agree to the terms. For Rubio, optimism appears to serve as both a strategy and a message. His remarks in Canada were not just aimed at reporters, they were aimed at capitals around the world, signalling that Washington believes multilateral diplomacy can still deliver results. Behind the scenes, aides say the Secretary's team has been in constant contact with counterparts from the European Union, Qatar and Egypt, as well as with UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres' office. The goal, to secure a consensus that avoids another deadlock at the Security Council. At the G7 photo session, ministers smiled for the cameras, Anita Anand at the centre, flanked by Barrett and Rubio. The tableau projected unity, but inside the closed-door sessions, debates were far less harmonious. French officials pushed for stronger human rights safeguards within the Gaza resolution. The Japanese delegation emphasised the need for a clear exit strategy. Germany pressed for commitments on reconstruction funding. Each concern reflected not just policy differences, but domestic political pressures back home. As the final communiques were drafted, journalists gathered outside, waiting for a statement. When Rubio eventually stepped before the microphones, the air was crisp and the light fading. "We don't want to lose momentum on this," he said, referring to the Gaza talks. It was a subtle acknowledgement that time is both ally and enemy. Every week of delay deepens Gaza's humanitarian catastrophe and erodes the world's confidence in international diplomacy. Back in Washington, analysts have described Rubio's recent diplomacy as pragmatic yet assertive, a contrast to the more transactional tone of previous US foreign policy chapters. His tenure, though still young, has already been tested by multiple crises: renewed Russian aggression in Eastern Europe, fragile ceasefires in the Middle East, and now the need to reassert American leadership through cooperation rather than coercion. Supporters see his optimism as strategic messaging. Critics call it wishful thinking. But on this chilly November day in Canada, his words served their immediate purpose, projecting momentum, however fragile. The broader context, of course, is one of fatigue, diplomatic fatigue, humanitarian fatigue, even media fatigue. The world's attention has been stretched thin, from refugee crises to climate disasters. Yet the Gaza resolution, in its complexity, represents a rare opportunity for unity. For the first time in months, G7 leaders and UN diplomats appear to agree on at least one principle: that Gaza's future cannot be left to chance or unilateral control. In the corridors of the United Nations, negotiators continue to work late into the night, parsing the wording of each clause. Terms like monitoring mission, security oversight, and international coordination mechanism are debated word by word. Every comma carries consequences. The final text, once released, will be scrutinised not just for what it promises, but for what it avoids, saying, will it authorise armed peacekeepers? Will it recognise a transitional authority? Will it address reconstruction? These questions remain unanswered, but the mood, as Rubio describes it, is cautiously hopeful. For Canada, hosting the G7 gathering was both symbolic and strategic. Ottawa wanted to demonstrate that the world's major democracies can still find common ground despite domestic challenges. Minister Annan's remarks alongside Rubio and Barrett emphasised precisely that point, that shared values must translate into shared action. Her message complemented Rubio's optimism, offering a reminder that multilateralism, while messy, remains indispensable. As the meeting concluded and delegations departed, the headlines focused on one word: optimism. It's a word that can sound thin in the face of tragedy, yet in diplomacy, it often signals the start of motion. From Hamilton's runway to the halls of the United Nations, that sense of forward movement, however incremental, matters. The Secretary of State's plane lifted off into the grey November sky, bound for Washington, where briefing papers and late-night calls awaited the world outside remains unsettled, the path forward uncertain. But for now, Marco Rubio's message echoes across diplomatic circles. Progress, however fragile, is still progress in the days to come. Attention will shift from words to outcomes. Will the resolution pass? Will an international force deploy to Gaza? Will nations commit to rebuilding what war has destroyed? These questions will define the coming weeks. For the families still trapped amid rubble and scarcity, optimism may seem distant, but it is perhaps the one thing diplomacy can still offer. As the cameras fade and the airport quiets, one image lingers: a US diplomat stepping aboard a plane, carrying with him the hopes of a weary international community. Behind the optimism lies the hard work of persuasion, the unglamorous grind of compromise, and the enduring belief that even in a fractured world, words can still open doors to peace.